Hello, everybody. I'm really excited to be here today with Glen. And Glen we're on this path of talking about what is life. And somewhere along the way, we got hooked on the idea of emergence. And Glen is going to talk about emergence from his perspective today and whatever else occurs to him.
Okay. So this is going to be a rather stream of consciousness talk today.
Good.
So I'm just going to let things go and see where things end up. So the theme I've been trying to stress is that computation is fundamental in looking at everything in the universe, life. And one of the first things I know is it's popular to say information and computation. And you'll see a lot of speakers will go into the implication that we're living in a simulation, that the universe is just one big program. But when you say computation is fundamental, is what you're saying is that relationships are more fundamental than things. And specifically, conditional relationships. So you can have unconditional relationship in the physical world would be like Newton's F equals ma, force equals mass times acceleration. That's a relationship, but it's unconditional. There's no if, else, then about it. Whereas computation shows up in the universe when there's a conditional aspect to relationships. And something has to be done. And that's where I use the word choice. Because if you have conditional relationships, then the outcome can't be predetermined. It has to be determined by something else. And so if the universe doesn't let you have choices in your options, then computation would be impossible. So that would be another way to...
Can you give an example of a conditional relationship? It was a good example of an unconditional relationship. So just
Well, the key and lock.
Okay.
Yes. That was one of the things that I've been trying to stress is that people, I think, see a computer, they think of computation as a computer. But if you dive into the theory of computation, there's some very primitive but abstract structures still qualify as computation. And the key and lock, I think, is one of the examples of the simplest. You know, there's an input, some kind of information gathering, the sensory stage. There's a decision, if, else, then, where the tumblers match up with the key profile. And then there's some kind of active state, or which I call the choice, where the mechanism, the computation decides an output to act back on its environment. So this gets back to the George Ellis video clip that I left in the last, where he talks about algorithms being as real as the physical objects.
Yeah, I like that.
Yes. Now that, if you start with computation is fundamental, that's one of the things that you run into right away, that implies relationships, conditional relationships, what you program, whatever you want to call it, is fundamental. It's real as any particle. And this gets us all into the area of, I think it's ontology. What's the study of what is real, what is the building blocks of the universe. Now, if you're a strict materialist, like somebody like a Sam Harris, the notion that an idea or an algorithm has any reality, they reject. And so for that world, the only things that are real are particles, stuff. And so you start with, this is the world of physics pretty much nowadays. And the standard model has fairly well captured what is the stuff. There's particles called fermions, which are the bricks, particles called bosons, which carry the force part, which are called bosons. Together, they account for just about everything that we see in the physical world. The one thing that's missing yet is combining gravity, space-time with the particles. But since physics is essentially a materialistic view, space-time, gravity has to be made of stuff too. So they're looking for the particles that mediate space, time, and gravity. And in that search, the stuff that they've decided is called information. So if you go into the world of cosmology and black holes, they talk about information. And what they're trying to say is somehow that is the building block. And the big search is to find out what constitutes information so that you get stuff out of it. And
Okay, so this is really helpful. So you're saying that there is at base, there's a difference between information and computation.
yes, well, especially in how it's used. So computation is fundamental, which requires information, input, knowledge about the environment around you. But what qualifies as information in that sense is what's useful. Whereas the cosmologist and that's not a use that computation would see.
You blanked out right after cosmologist.
Okay, they are treating information as if it's another kind of particle and put it into the physical or the materialist ontology box where everything that is real is just stuff, is things. Which is not how we use the term information when we're talking about computation. And that's one of the debates you get into, or you will find if you dive into the theories behind Maxwell's demon and entropy. There's a big question as to what is information. It's not just counting states, which is the one way of saying it's stuff. Information in the Landauer sense, or the strong emergence sense, is useful for defining relationships. Again, computation is about relationships, conditional relationships. To make those decisions, you need to know something about the world and the things you're interacting with.
Okay, so then if we take the lock and key example, then what qualifies as information in that example?
The profile of the key.
The profile of the key, okay.
Mhm.
Got it.
But that profile of the key could also be a digital sequence of numbers as well.
Sure.
If you go into any engineering situation, you can program a key and lock as a digital signal with a decoder logic. That's one of the things I was hoping that people would grasp, is that the relationship between the key profile and the input and output actions doesn't necessarily have to be mechanical. It could be anything. And so in that sense, it's the inside is hidden from the outside. Yeah, the person using the key doesn't care what's inside the lock. It's the relationship that the person is dealing with.
Well,
and
the big picture that flies up into my mind when I get up to the level of consciousness is how pattern works on our consciousness. When we pick up on a particular pattern that fits into the consciousness, and all of a sudden it opens up the field of choices.
Yeah, you can say you've encountered new information in your environment.
Yeah.
A pattern has showed up that you haven't noticed before, and you realize now there's new information that you can use for decisions. Now here's the fun part, and I think this is, or Michael might find it interesting, is if algorithms, which are just relationships, are real, then ideas must be real. If ideas are real, are archetypes, in the Jungian sense, real? We can ask, is math discovered or invented? Can we ask, are archetypes discovered or invented? And start playing that game, that's when the Old Testament really starts to hit you. When you realize it's not a bunch of stories. If you believe archetypes are discovered, not invented, then the Old Testament is about something real within the universe. I think Jordan Peterson, I don't think he's explicitly said that, but listening to him talk, that's the line his thinking is taking. And I think that's part of the Jordan Peterson Christian phenomena that Paul Vanderklay has encountered. People are realizing that there's something real, honestly real there, and are coming back. But they're not looking at it the way scripture and how we're taught growing up in Sunday school to look at things. So now there's a conflict.
Well, that's one of the reasons that for decades, I have not been at all afraid of these people who say, oh, well, that pattern showed up in Osiris and that pattern showed up in Buddha and that.
Mhm.
Well, of course it did. It shows up in all these places long before it's codified in the Bible because it's real,
Yeah,
and it's like there's ideas that thread through language like that as well. So when people get all freaked out because if someone says, oh, well, there's some truth to what Buddha said. Well, of course there is, because truth is a thing.
mhm,
The truth is going to show up everywhere. Now, it might show up corrupted, it might show up disjointed, it might show up kind of broken up into pieces, but the kernel of truth is still there because truth is a thing. It's always been a thing.
mhm. Exactly. So
I
you're
made
right.
your thread. You were saying algorithms are relationships. If algorithms, which are relationships, if they are real, then ideas are real and archetypes are real. And then is math discovered or invented? Are archetypes discovered or invented? And that was the
That's the same kind of question. You could ask that is art, a work of art discovered, invented? Is a piece of music discovered or invented?
Mhm.
That's a question that somebody like Sam Harris can't answer, because in his world, to the extent I understand it, his consciousness is just a bunch of chemicals and electrical impulses between neurons. And that if you recreate the same pattern of chemicals and neural impulses, you'll recreate the same emotions and consciousness. But then that begs the question, well, where does math come from then? Is math just invented because of certain neural connections, and then how does it keep repeating? Whereas if you assume that archetypes are real, even the laws of physics are real, then as creatures interacting in the world, we've constructed a language that reflects the physical world around us. So that's one of the areas that's really fun to dive into, is how natural language, reflects what's in the environment. So,
Is language discovered or invented?
well, I think language is a skill that's built into us at some kind of programming level, but what we
I
use
think
it
so
for
too, yeah.
is what's amazing. So now I've lost my thread. I need to get back.
The works of art, pieces of music, laws of physics discovered or
Mhm.
invented. And then you were talking about natural language.
Right, but that's probably a talk for another day, because a lot of our ideas that we're sitting around here talking, we pull out of natural language. Math logic, the study began back in the mid 1800s. Frege was the mathematician, and he was basically, hopefully I get this close, trying to study how you could do a word problem. What is in a word problem in natural language that you can pull out and give structure to? So that was the first hints of pulling out of statements something true and false and conditional. So that was the beginning of math logic, was trying to understand word problems. But I often thought that we can talk about word problems in the first place is that somehow the laws of nature and rules of logic have incorporated themselves into our natural language just out of Darwinian selection. So that's a fun thing to think about. But try to get back to where I was before. If you start with computation as fundamental, then one of the first things that falls out is strong emergence becomes real. And I would say, back up, when we say something is displaying intelligence or is acting intelligently, what we're saying is that it's modeling a computational behavior. So, F equals MA, that's unconditional. That's not a computational, and we don't say it's intelligent, but if we see something that's doing this if else then action on its inputs, that's when we say it's acting intelligently. So strong emergence falls out of this directly, because if you have intelligent agents now, collect them together and you give them some kind of rules to interact with each other, now a larger intelligence shows up. And that's what we call the strong emergence, is the presence of cooperative or collective intelligence. So a lot of people in the science community reject strong emergence. Anecdotally, it seems like the physicists who are most against strong emergence are also atheists. And I think one of the reasons they're afraid of it is it does imply that relationships are fundamental, and then you get to the whole spiritual pathway, which no one wants to go to if you're a strict materialist. Like I say, if archetypes are real, then morality is real. The laws of physics point you to true morality. A lot of people say religion and science don't have anything to do with each other, but once you buy into computation, strong emergence, relationships being fundamental, you're stuck looking at some kind of absolute morality woven into the fabric of the universe. So that's plenty of meat for a debate right there, I think. But strong emergence now, once you buy into that, immediately implies that there are layering phenomena going on in life. So you have parts. So like I say, it's a whole part relationship. You have parts that come together, they interact with each other based on certain rules. Again, computational rules, if else then. You can call it a social order. Some new dynamic shows up, strongly emergent, and we create a new layer. That whole is greater than the sum of the parts, as they always say. But the trick is that whole now can become a part in something even bigger, providing that you have enough holes, spelled with WH, with a social order that can interact with each other. And so strong emergence, again, implies a layering to Mother Nature, to the rules. So I have kind of stressed at the beginning this inside-outside view, and I might have overdone it, but what I was trying to do is get people used to or ready to thinking in terms of layers. Within each layer of emergence, there's certain rules, certain definitions apply within that layer. And a lot of the confusion that we have in discussions of consciousness and you name it, comes from the fact that we're trying to use definitions, applying them the same across multiple layers of emergence. And we need to be careful when we define certain words that we define them within a certain layer. And I know this is kind of strange, but the image that comes to mind, you remember those old 3D pictures that were popular in the 90s? Where if you hold your eyes just right, you could see the dinosaur come out. Mm-hmm. Emergence is sort of like that. You have to look at it a certain way in order to see it. And I think most people aren't accustomed to seeing layers. Its tendency is to see a continuum from atoms up through animals, through life to consciousness, and not see that there's steps. And each step becomes a part which allows you to next step up. And so on the origins of life side, it avoids the computational explosion problem because you don't have to go from proteins to a living cell. If you can break it down into layers of emergence, strong emergence, then you can see a sort of potential for a step-by-step bootloader process to work your way up I'd be really curious if someone in the science, chemistry, or biology would look into that. But so far, it's an area that the academia seems to stay away from. The actual people who should probably be doing it are the mathematicians and theoretical physicists. But that would be career suicide to try that, so no one's doing it. But it offers potential. I'm not saying it's real or not. I'm just pointing out that if you buy strong emergence and you start looking at the universe that way, it opens a pathway, a possible pathway that gets around the computational explosion, which is basically the gap in the God in the gaps argument of intelligence designers. So if we get back to this notion of definitions applying within each level, then we can see things like consciousness. When physicists or people use it, mostly it's biologists. It's strictly an attribute of us human beings. You know, this question is, well, are animals conscious or plants? That becomes debatable. But if you see the world as a continuum from atoms up through humans, you don't see that each level of emergence has its own definition of consciousness. Then you have to explain somehow where consciousness comes from out of nowhere at the last moment. And then you get into the panpsychics who suggest, well, it's always there, it's in everything, it just finally shows up. Or you get the kind of the dualist thinking that the mind and the body are two different things, that somehow you put the body together and then consciousness just magically shows up. Whereas I think emergence, strong emergence, eliminates that problem because it's there starting at a very rudimentary level. I would say the lock at the level that we're talking about it is conscious of the key. Now, a lot of people say, no, that's not what consciousness means. But I'm saying within that level of emergence that you're working at, that would be the definition of consciousness. Its universe is the universe of keys. And each layer up then, consciousness applies to what's available at that level of emergence. And what that level is the computational system that's running and what information is appropriate to it. And the range of information, you can call it its universe, and its ability to be aware of the information in its universe, you just refer to as consciousness. And if you're willing to do that, I think there's a word in C++ where you overdefine a word. And so you can use a function. So I think that's one of the pushbacks you get is you try to define consciousness one way and people say, no, that's not it. If you break the universe up into layers and then realize that definitions apply within each layer separately, I think that eliminates a lot of the problems. So
I don't want to derail you because I love where you're going, but I do want to interject here for just a second. And I took notes so I can hopefully get you back on track. When you're talking about this, each level of emergence having its own experience of consciousness, I can't help but think of Rupert Sheldrake's theory of morphic resonance. Not that I necessarily agree that his theory is right, but at least he's thinking about these things because he's thinking about what is it that gets particles to move together in a certain way at each level of emergence. Mm-hmm. And that there has to be some sort of signal or some sort of computation or some sort of information that's available at each level for these things to come together. And so he's done a lot of work on this whole thing of how sound has certain images that are created in particles or in water at various levels, and that at the highest level in terms of how living entities are put together, that there's a universal memory of some kind that tells things how to connect up. I mean, that it's a very complicated theory, and I don't know that I agree with it, but at least he's thinking about these things. And of course, he is on the outside of the scientific community to a great extent because of that, but he also has a big platform for talking about his ideas. So it's not exactly career suicide.
Well, I've seen his name. He shows up a lot on YouTube, and I remember trying to listen to some of his stuff. I agree with, he's one of the blind men and the elephant. He's aware that something's going on,
Yeah.
but I disagree with his conclusions.
Yeah, that's the way I.
Completely.
But he does.
Yeah.
At least he's thinking about all these levels.
Yeah, and Carl Friston again. I don't agree with his conclusions, but it's clear to me he's picking up on something that's real, and to that extent, I think he's a good place to start if people want to listen to this stuff.
Well, yeah, I'm pretty excited because one of our viewers had recommended a book called The Hidden Spring, about the source of consciousness, and it's written by Mark Solms, who is a colleague of Carl Friston. They've worked together. And just on the off chance, I contacted him to see if he would come on and talk. And so he's going to come on next week.
Oh, wow.
And we're going to talk about his book. And he comes to some pretty radical conclusions about where consciousness comes from. So I'm eager to pick his brain. And yeah, so that'll be interesting. Anyway, that's coming up.
Yeah. So
you want to get, you know where you're headed? Or should I remind you?
Well, I shouldn't comment because that would derail us. But no, what I'm proposing is radically different than anything you'll find on YouTube. So I'm not trying to be an apostle for some new definition of consciousness, but I am someone who's popped the hood and looked at the engine and been down there and said, you know, there's something going on down here, and maybe we should look at it. So. Mostly hopefully I'm proposing stuff that people haven't heard and give them pause to think. So, back to strong emergence.
Yes, okay.
Okay. You'll see that debated a lot. There's a book I recommended, Re-Emergence of Emergence, which is it's a collection of essays from some of the top spokespeople in the area of emergence. It's just been collected into one book. You don't necessarily have to buy it because all of the authors in there are to be found on Closer to Truth, that website. It's easier to listen to them in 10-minute interviews rather than trying to read a book. But a lot of them are neuroscientists, biologists, chemists, some physicists. George Ellis is one of the people he's in the book. I like his ideas about computation or algorithms being real, relationships being real. But most of them look at emergence as consciousness. People explicitly say consciousness, human consciousness is the only example of strong emergence. And like I've pointed out before, that gets you into a problem because then where does consciousness arise? Where did it come from? Whereas if you start with it's always been there, we just have been using the wrong definitions, then it's not such a problem. One of the things that's been pointed out is there also a concept of weak emergence. And a lot of people have suggested that that's all there is weak emergence. And strong is just, it's just because we don't understand completely. Now it's been interesting, it's been pointed out by more than a few people that there's a fundamental qualitative difference between weak emergence and strong. Weak emergence implies that the materialist, the physicalist view of the universe is all that's necessary. Strong emergence implies that relationships are real, which breaks from the materialist view. So to believe in strong emergence is to believe that things that are fundamental and real to take. So that's why I think it's a lot of physicists and scientists reject strong emergence because of where it wants to take you.
Okay, so
Some of
can
the,
you explain that to me. Why is it that, so weak emergence implies that physicalism is all that's necessary. And then you said strong emergence implies that relationships are real. And that there's more than just the physical. So where do you get that implication?
weak emergence is that if you've put enough stuff together, something new happens. And whatever that new something is completely explainable in terms of the underlying physics. So thermodynamics, statistical mechanics is a perfect example of weak emergence. Temperature, pressure, those are no, you don't, there's nothing there about atoms, but you can start from atoms and the interactions of scattering, electrostatic, whatever, and build up all the mathematics that you need to explain temperature, pressure. And so for materialists, that's the hint that everything can be built up. If we just knew enough about the universe, we could explain everything, including human consciousness, because human consciousness is just chemicals and electrical signals. Strong emergence implies that something new happens, which is not reducible or explainable from the underlying physics. And so that introduces something new into the mix, which was not there before. And it acts like magic. And so that would tend to make the materialists uncomfortable, because now there's no step-by-step way they can walk from atoms and electrons and to consciousness. So
But
I'm not sure.
doesn't that work both ways? I mean, I've heard some people who buy strong emergence who say that therefore we're headed towards, creating that the universe itself is creating something bigger and better. And, I mean, some of them talk even about creating God, that they can create God out of this strong emergence, as though because strong emergence, therefore there's no need for anything before. I mean, I've heard that argument too. So it doesn't.
Yeah, and that's exactly the problem. That people of faith are afraid of the strong emergence because it does take out, like I say, the last gap in the God and the gaps arguments, because now you potentially can explain everything up to and including human consciousness and religion and spirituality, starting from just the basic rules. So it pushes religion out. And so some people are cheering because they think, oh, we don't need a religion. But the flip side is now relationships are fundamental, archetypes are fundamental. Now you're back to looking at the Old Testament as something, a real document about how the universe works.
Well, and that's exactly the crux of the problem right there. So with strong emergence, you could go one of two ways. There's always two ways to everything. So you can go off into the, then there's no need for faith or God or anything, and you've knocked out all the God of the gaps arguments. And if you go that direction, you head into like Brett Weinstein. I heard him talking the other day, maybe it was a long ago, but it was something that Paul had clipped out, where he's talking about, at the end of the day, there's no difference between a liver fluke and a human being in terms of purpose. Their purpose is the same, to make their genes go on into the future. Well, if you come to that conclusion that my purpose is no bigger or different than the purpose of a liver fluke, then what's to stop genocide? What's to stop totalitarian power plays? There's nothing in the way.
Right. But see, that's the view that
are true, then it's a wholly different thing.
But the archetypes live at a certain level of emergence. And I would say that's the level above us, that we as individuals have come together and formed a collective consciousness. And that archetypes live at that level of reality, one above us. And we call transcendence, it's that top-down causality, which is one of the hallmarks of strong emergence, is what's pulling us. We call it transcendence, the sense that life is not about us. I think that's one way to put it. Well, if it's not about us, what is it? And there's something above us. And I think that's, if you play the emergence game, then you start to see that. We are different from a Lancet fluke because our experience is at a higher level of emergence. We're not just living organisms, we're living organisms that have a social structure, which has a language and is capable of learning. And because of that, we've created societies and cultures, which is something now that you can look at as a culture or society as a life form in its own right. A narrative becomes a relationship, causal, conditional relationship between individuals.
There is this
So,
interesting thing though about hierarchies, right? I mean, you're
Mhm.
talking basically about a hierarchy. You're talking about
Right.
a mountain, and the archetypes live above us. In fact, the archetypes live above the top of the hierarchy. They live up above the top of the hierarchy,
Yeah.
calling us up, and the top-down causality and all of that. But every hierarchy has a foundation,
Mhm.
and that foundation comes from somewhere. And so to imagine that without the transcendence being involved at both ends of the hierarchy is vapid. I mean,
Yeah.
if computation, and I know you can't say this because you're a physicist, but I'll say it. If computation is fundamental, then computation is coming from somewhere. It doesn't just stumble into being without any
Mhm.
intelligence, or so I don't see why strong emergence evaporates the last gap in the God of the gaps argument. I don't understand when you said that.
Well, it's more of a nut and bolt kind of a view. Because I remember when our talk, I was comparing the startup of a computer to a bootstrapping process. And if you can bootstrap the first life form by starting from something simple, non-biological life form, and then allow that to create the next layer up, and then the next layer up, you avoid the computational explosion, which you look at a bacteria and you just go, well, there's no way. Not even if you had 1 trillion lifetimes of the universe, that something like that would happen simply by chance. But if you take that away and say, well, maybe there's a pathway that could, step by step, from simple things, get you to what we call life. I think, to the extent that I understand the intelligent design argument, I think that would end it. But scientists haven't pursued that path. So it's all open for debate at this point.
So you're saying if there were enough
But
steps between the very first and then up to the bacteria, if there were enough steps, and if each step had within it a level of emergence where the next level up was unpredictable from the level before, and it had more complexity, that you could build that complexity up to the point where you get to the simplest. I think I sent you that article about the simplest living cell. It took, I don't even
yes,
remember how many hours of computation to even analyze what was in it, much less how it worked. It would have taken probably all the time in the universe to explain how it worked, because there's so much complexity inside that simplest living cell.
yeah.
You're saying if there was
But-
enough time, you could get from one level up to that level.
right,
Isn't
providing you made
problem
providing the steps were simple enough. Yes, you could. The odds, like you say, the computational combinatoric explosion, you can cut it down way down if you do a few simple steps, then you reset the counter, so to speak. Do simple steps, reset the counter, then the combinatoric explosion doesn't happen. I'm just saying that it's a possibility.
Who's resetting the counter?
Well, no, that's emergence. A new order appears, and then the next layer up doesn't have to deal with what's inside. It only deals with the outside relationships.
But even that is totally mysterious. How does that happen, that the next layer up just, coincidentally doesn't have to deal with all the complexity of the lower below? It can just.
Well, that's one of the mysteries of the universe, I guess.
Yeah,
That's what
I
makes
think
physics
you can get rid
fascinating.
of all the gaps in the God of the gaps argument, and there's still the mysteries of the universe left. So.
Right, yeah, it doesn't, yeah. Eliminating the intelligent design argument does not make the universe any less mysterious. A quick comment on the two paths, I would actually say it's a boomerang. You go out one way thinking you've gotten rid of God, and all of a sudden you realize, no, you haven't, that you're still stuck with something that for all practical purposes is God. And now you have to deal with that. So, but
Really a much
speaking,
bigger picture of God than, certainly since I started down this path, my picture of God has gotten bigger and bigger and bigger.
so I can dive into the more details of the emergence, or we can stick with the more metaphysical side, which is probably more.
Dive into more details of emergence, definitely.
Well, I originally thought of looking at some of the various authors, and one of them was David Chalmers. I think you actually sent me one of his pieces. He's very prominent on YouTube, and I think he's a mathematician, but he approaches it as a philosopher. And he made some interesting statements. This is one of the problems that you run into when you're trying to study this stuff. He was talking about decidability, deducibility, reducibility, consistency. Those are words that come up, vocabulary words in talks of emergence. And I've noticed that they use them rather loosely. And so I thought we could talk about that, how we use the terms. So, or we can go back. I'd rather talk about the implications of strong emergence for faith right now.
Okay, that's fine.
As regards to my faith, as more I dive into the strong emergence, I become more and more convinced that what's in scripture is real in some actual physical sense. It's telling us something about how we work, the fact that archetypes are there. But where do we find God now if we've taken God out of the physics? If physics can explain some of this stuff. And what I'm finding is the church is doing is moving itself farther and farther out of the mainstream. And I'm thinking in more medieval times, Christian God was seen to be in everything, everywhere, permeating and motivating stuff. Now, as science has become capable of explaining more and more things, I think our church has gotten, okay, well, we'll let you explain that with science, but we'll keep our spirituality out here. And so our faith has step by step over the generations been moving farther and farther out of the mainstream of physical reality. And what I'm thinking is strong emergence, what I'm sensing and what I really would love to hear some opinions on is going to finally push our faith outside of the physical universe. From here, it's common for us people to say, well, the spiritual is separate from the physical world. And it seems natural to say that. But if you come back to the God in the Gaps article, if you can't find God in the gaps, then you have to ask the question, if the God that made us, gave us the scriptures, is the same God that made the physical universe, you would think his handprints should be all over it. So how is it that we could look at the universe and not see God? The fact that we're not, to me, says that we're getting something wrong somewhere. But I don't know. I'm not a theologian. I don't want to step on that landmine. But I would love to hear possibly Paul Vanderklee's take on something like that, or some of the other speakers that you have.
Well, I think this is one of the reasons, and I'm not putting myself at the level of Paul Vanderklay or some of the other thinkers that have been on here, but I think this is one of the reasons that I've been so compelled to follow this thread of the elements and principles. Because the elements and principles of design, in my view, are God's handprints all over everything. But it's not in the way that the intelligent designers are talking about design. They're talking about design from, I don't even know. They're just saying that when you see something that has intelligence in it, you can see the mark of design. But I think it goes up another level above that, or maybe below. I'm not sure where it would be in the hierarchy, but the elements and principles of design show up at every level, whether it's the quantum level or the atomic level or the molecular level or the biological or the chemical level. It shows up everywhere because they're principles, they're fundamentals and they're principles. And how can that be if, I mean, okay, a person could make the argument, well, it is that way because as human beings, we develop this way of seeing the world. And so we use this language of elements and principles, and that's why we see it everywhere. You could make that argument. Or you could make the argument the other way around and say, the reason we see those things is because they are everywhere. And I mean, and when you see it in a tree, you see it in the way consciousness works with pattern. I mean, you just see it everywhere. In fact, you said something at the beginning of our conversation about, what was it that you said? You were talking about, well, I can't find it now, but I think it has to do with the whole and part relationship, layering phenomena. I mean, the way that art is created, whether it's musical art or painted art or written art, these principles of design that are laid out show up everywhere. And that says to me that there's something way bigger that we're not looking at. My mind isn't big enough to grasp it all because I don't understand all of these things that I'm hearing, but I can see the pattern everywhere I look. So yeah, I mean, I think we have to, but I'm not sure. Well, on the one hand, I can understand what you're saying when you say we have to push outside the physical universe for our answers, because God is outside the way C.S. Lewis always talked about it is God isn't a part of the show, he's the whole show. Not in the sense of pantheism, not in the sense that everything that is God, but that God is outside of space and time and inside of space and time, but not in the way that, I mean, obviously we're not gonna, he's so big that we wouldn't even be able to recognize him if we saw him.
Well, it's beyond us. We're finite creatures. We're imperfect, finite creatures.
Yes.
Back to Nimahar Kanehama, it's how do you approach the truth? You know, when you're just an imperfect creature, there's certain self-disciplines that people have to, but you never really have it. The best you can do is, glimpse the cloak of God, as he walks by, but you'll never see him face to face. That might be an analogy. The thing that troubles me as the church pulls God out of the physical universe, I've actually, basically, the scripture is where you find truth. If it doesn't match what's in scripture or how someone interprets it, then it's not the truth. And I keep thinking, well, yeah, but once you do that, you've taken God out of the physical world. And now how do you explain things to people who aren't Christians? My grand challenge to the church is, how do you explain to someone in your own words, from your own experience, what it means to be saved without reference to the Bible or quoting scripture? That's a challenge, because the only way you can do that is to reference the life and the world around you. And if we've taken truth and placed it in a book somewhere outside of the physical world, we've sort of taken away its power to touch and work in the real world. So,
Well, I mean, Romans 1 tells us that that is possible, that he is to be seen in his creation without reference to God's word, right?
Right.
But
then I get,
here, I wanna read to you a little quote from a comment that Paul Gordon Collier made on Paul Vanderklay's video that he made today, which, by the way, he's been going through Matthew Pajot's book, The Language of Creation, and very, very interesting. I mean, I read that book a couple of years ago. Well, I read half of it and then I stopped. But there's some very interesting ideas in there, but the way Paul's going through it is really fun. But here's what he said, and he's talking about error, but I mean, that's the flip side of truth, right? So I think this is a really interesting principle. Error that is lived out gives a greater understanding than error expressed. I think this is the nature of creation contending for the final resolution. The wood and straw in us will yet be the fuel for the furnace that refines the gold. But I thought this was interesting, that error that is lived out gives a greater understanding than error expressed. And you can flip that as well to say that truth that is lived out gives a greater understanding than truth expressed. So it's the living out of these things that brings about the reality of whether or not what we're thinking is truth or error. Right?
Right. So relationships exist in nowhere. They have to take a physical form before they can act in the world. So for us to act in the world is what makes us alive. That's what makes us things important. Just sitting there thinking or saying stuff, to me, isn't being alive. It's to get out there and do. And even if you make mistakes and screw things up, it's better to do than to sit there and not do. So maybe that's agreeing with you or not. I'm not sure.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, that's exactly it. That's exactly it. And of course, whenever we say something like that, you go, well, duh, yeah, of course we see that. But we don't really see that, because if we did, we wouldn't have all these arcane arguments about heady philosophical things that are how many angels are dancing on the head of a pin, or how many genders exist. Because when you get down to the level of lived reality, you either align with reality, which is truth, or you don't align with reality, and that's error. And you find that out very quickly when you're actually living.
Right. But what we've seen today is, for a lot of people, especially like my kids, their reality is social media, the internet. They don't want to drive. They don't want to get out. They don't even go see their friends. I remember when we were kids, I would get on my bike and ride halfway across town to see my friends. They just go on and text on it. So they're really out of touch with physical reality. And it's kind of scary that the feedback they're getting is a narrative which is not tied to physical reality. So it's better to get out and take your bumps.
Yeah, and unfortunately, we're heading more and more in that direction. You know, like since COVID, everybody had to stay in and start doing their jobs from home. My husband's company has decided to get rid of their physical building. COVID or no COVID, they're not going to have people coming back. And that's probably not the only company that's doing that, which means everybody will only be knowing people through the screen.
That's, as a hardware designer, you can't work that way. You know, you're designing hardware, you got to work with people, you got to be there with the techs, the workbench. I've tried to do work as a consultant on occasions where I'm separate from the people, and it's always ends up being a disaster. So, but yeah, mostly I'm a very mechanical, kinesthetic kind of person. So when I read things or listen to things, I'm always filtering out, okay, what can I use to build something with? So I'm not much when it comes to academic arguments. I tend to look So yeah, I'm not familiar with a lot of the philosophers or spokespeople, especially in theology and those ideas. On the side, I've personal projects are machine learning, which is one of the sources for a lot of my ideas. And the other is, which has been very intriguing, is using cellular automata as computational systems, which is a really fascinating direction to go. And if someone's interested, Dave Ackley at University of New Mexico. Beyond that, I'm not going to dive into it because it's too complicated. So yeah, I'm more interested in what I can do to build something with.
That's interesting because, you know, when Ian McGilchrist is talking about the work that goes on between the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere, the left hemisphere is the builder.
Mm-hmm.
The right hemisphere is the one that proposes the problem, and then the left hemisphere takes the problem and builds something out of it. And then in the best instance, the left hemisphere brings that building back and the left and right hemisphere present it together.
Mm-hmm.
And it sounds as though because you are kinesthetic, that even though you have a tendency to go towards the left hemisphere, it's that kinesthetic side of you that brings you back and makes you think about these deeper issues.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, I don't know what happened. Physics major in high school, but I was the only one in the science group that took shop classes every year from 7th grade through 12th. So I was as comfortable with the milling machine or lathe or welding as I was with the soldering iron and doing electronics. So I'm kind of odd in that respect, but I've always been that way.
Well, it ties you to reality.
Mm-hmm. Right. But in a way, it makes you seem kind of dull because you can't argue all of the fine points of theology and philosophy. On the other side, I think it's kept me honest because I focus on what works, what doesn't work. How do I build something? How do I fix something? So that's how I approach a lot of stuff. That's my approach to, in some sense, my faith as well. How does it work out in the real world? I'm not so much one who reads and memorizes scripture so much as I'll focus on a parable and try and relate it to myself and put myself in that place and to sort of meditate or contemplate it for the same parable for weeks or months at a time, coming back to it, reanalyzing it, thinking myself, putting myself in it and living it.
Mm-hmm. That's powerful. That's really powerful. I think I probably mentioned to you before, I know you have to go soon, but I think I had probably mentioned to you before about this really wonderful book that I read when I was in Japan. It was written by a Japanese woman who had won a major prize in Japan for this book. And it's based on a true story, but obviously she took some liberties with it. But it's about a guy back in probably 1910 who was challenged by a street preacher to just take one verse of scripture and try to live it. And that if he did that, he would find out whether God was real or not.
Mm-hmm.
And the verse that he chose was love your enemies. And so it's about the process of him trying to live out just those 3 words,
Mm-hmm.
and then discovering that in his flesh it was impossible. Mm-hmm. And then he went on to come to faith in Christ because of that, and then later gave his life for a number of other people. So it's a really powerful, beautiful story. But I always thought about that God's word is real in that sense, mm-hmm. that if you try to live it, you will find very soon that without the God that wrote it, you can't live it. Mm-hmm. And maybe that's what the universe is really all about too.
Well, yeah, personally, I came back to my faith, Christian faith, in the early 20s after I discovered St. Francis. And I'd grown up in Sunday school with all the lessons and the verses. And then his way of reading the scriptures was to just pray for days. And then he would open up the Bible and he would read what was in front of him. And that's what he would work with. And I came to understand that my faith wasn't about words, it was about faith, trusting. And I didn't need to know all the words. I just needed to trust. And that gave me a completely different perspective on my faith, and is what allowed me to come back to the church, because now all of a sudden it wasn't just a bunch of words and rituals. But getting back to the faith thing and growing in faith has been one of my big questions. What does that mean to say grow in faith? I've heard people who think that that means reading the Bible cover to cover for the 6th or 7th time. I've heard one person say that their growing in faith was memorizing 50 more Bible verses they could bring up in conversation. But ask yourself why? What's the point? And one of the things that the strong emergence arguments really have hit me with is if you play out all of the implications, is that the future is not set. Our choices decide what the future is. So it forces predestination out of the picture. We become co-creators with God. We're not actors in a play, like in Hamlet. In reference to, I think, your last video, there's a great play / film, Rosencrantz and Guildenstern Are Dead. I don't know if you've seen it. And that's the point. It's looking at the Hamlet from the point of view of the two characters. And the Shakespeare keeps showing up in the story, trying to tell them what's happening, and then you never figure it out. But if that's what life is, if it was all destined right from the beginning, we have no choice, then we are actors in a play. But if you take the alternate view that we have choice, then that means the future is not determined, that we are become co-creators. We are deciding the future with God. And again, I think that's what makes the Old Testament and the archetypes so seriously important, because now it's important to make the right choices. Yeah, it's not just all up to God. Things will be what they will. No, you're sharing in the future reality. And again, I'd like to hear, that's where the open theism starts to show up, is that the future is not settled. We are deciding the future with God. He's walking with us, not deciding us. He's not the playwright, he's a companion. And I think, to me, that's a wonderful way to look at God's presence in our life. But you have to choose. It's your predestination or walk. And I've often thought, well, maybe that's what it means to grow in faith, is you go from being a child in faith to being an adult. You know, our kids grow up, they have kids, they rebelled when they were teenagers, and then, well, like for me, you know, you get old and you have kids and your family, and then you really appreciate your parents, and you go, oh, that's what it was all about. That's, you know, and I have to say, I didn't understand the Old Testament creation story until I had kids. And I understood that's not a vengeful God. That's a loving parent trying to tell the kids, watch out, be careful, don't. But I think a lot of young people who haven't had families don't see that. They're still reacting to the God of the Old Testament as a parent, adult parental authority figure.
Well, maybe that open theism debate would be an interesting one to have a conversation about with somebody else on the channel. I'm thinking about.
Yeah, someone else besides me, because I just feel like the physics doorstep and said, okay, here's your options. And I don't know. I'm not expert. I don't understand. All I know is it's not a question that can simply go away by telling me I don't know what I'm doing.
Well,
it's a challenge.
Would be an interesting conversation to have with you as part of the conversation, because if we get off too much into the, you know, philosophical airy-fairy, you can bring us back to the physics and say, well, but now wait a minute, this is what's actually happening here.
Well, it'd be
the Julian Barber has been a popular idea on the channel, but I also know when I read about Julian Barber online, what other people say about him. They say that he's completely on the outskirts of physics because he's been following his own idea about time not existing, not at all, that there is no past and there is no future, there's only the now. And I read that and I think, well, how can there, I can understand there not being a future at this point because we are building the future, but we can see the past. We can see all the buildings that were built in the past. I mean, there's a structure there. So how could there be no past?
The universe forgets. You can see the structure of the building, but let's come back 1,000 years from now. What will be there? Was that the poem Ozymandias? About the great and powerful, you know, and the kingdom, and all that's left now is a statue laying down on the desert. That's one of the questions that physics puts up, is that the universe forgets too.
Well, that would be an interesting thing for next time. Maybe you've touched on this idea of loss of information.
Mhm.
I would like to talk about that. Is that a possibility?
Yes. Mhm.
Okay, so maybe next time we'll talk about the loss of information. I mean, just the whole idea of information and entropy and maybe past and future and all that together with the loss of information would be a good topic.
Okay, but yeah, I would love to hear other people's ideas on the questions I have posed.
Well, this is a big call. Everybody out there, please get on and make comments on this discussion so that we have some meat to work with. And
yeah, I've noticed that some of my talks have actually gotten some good comments. So
yeah,
I take that as a bit of validation.
I always love the comment thread, and this is just, just so that this gets out there to more people. If you happen to click the subscribe button and click the like and all that kind of stuff, it would be much appreciated. We are increasing our subscriber base substantially in the last couple of months, so that's exciting.
Okay.
Yeah, well, thank you very much, Glenn. This has been extremely interesting, and there's a lot here for me to think about. I might actually try to go back and make a transcript of all that you said, because you laid it out really beautifully.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, thank you. And I don't know what to do for next talk. This is kind of an anticlimax for anything after this.
Well,
so
no,
we'll have to discuss that.
I want to pursue this idea of loss of information, and I'll send you some of Michael's comments about that, because he would tell you what he's pondering, and then that might get you thinking about something.
Great.
Okay.
Okay.
Have a good day.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Bye now.